What's going on, everyone? Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres with ScoopDuck on 3, coming to you on Friday, January 3rd, 2025. Happy New Year to everybody. No, it's been a little bit since I did one of these podcasts here, whether you're listening to the Ducks Dish podcast on the podcasting platform or watching us here on the ScoopDuck on 3 YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you find us. Hope everyone had an awesome holiday season and a good start to the new year. I know that Oregon had a rough start to the new year. We're going to break down the Rose Bowl. I was on scene covering that game in Pasadena for our readers over at ScoopDuck.com, and we're going to break down my full reaction and thoughts to this game. So right off the top, number 1 Oregon falls to number 8 Ohio State, 41-21 in the Rose Bowl in the quarterfinal of the college football playoff, in a result that really shocked a lot of people, myself included. I'm sure a lot of Duck fans included as well. And this is a game where Oregon fell behind from the start, showed a little bit of some signs of life on the tail end of that first half, and then scoring in the opening drive of the second half gave you a little bit of hope and wondering, well, could Oregon pull off some kind of a comeback here? And then those hopes got dashed when Ohio State just kept putting up points and Oregon's offense just continued to struggle in what was a really long day at the office for the Ducks. For me, I think when I look at this game and start to break it down, you obviously have to ask yourself some of these questions. You can ask about the college football playoff seeding, the matchups, and how Oregon had a difficult path to the national championship. But at the end of the day, you have to just line it up. You have to put your cleats on. You have to put your pads on, your helmet on, just like that other team, regardless of if you just played a week ago or if you've been off for 3 weeks. So I think a lot of people are asking, now that this game is over and Oregon got trounced in this one, more or less, did that long layoff affect the Ducks? And I think you can clearly see to some degree that it did. Oregon looked kind of lethargic coming out. They came out really flat versus when I was watching Ohio State, even just watching their guys go in motion in the backfield when they were on offense. Just everything was crisp, on time, with a purpose. That was a team that was ready. And Oregon wasn't. That's the reality of what we saw unfold at the Rose Bowl. And I think I really wasn't expecting this result, because the first time these two teams played, they played each other really close. I had some confidence that Oregon was going to win this game. I put my prediction in for Oregon to win by 1 touchdown. I thought that the Ducks had the edge at the line of scrimmage with Jordan Birch back, with Ohio State's offensive line banged up, having to navigate some injuries throughout the season. You look at the momentum that they had from the first matchup when Derek Harmon had that strip, when he got a fumble, and then, God, they just, I think watching what Oregon was able to do the first time around, it just made me think, okay, like Oregon has risen to this point where they can hang with Ohio State and eventually beat Ohio State. That was in Eugene, but the Rose Bowl, I think you look at that as an Oregon fan, you kind of consider the Rose Bowl a home game, right? But there was a lot of red in that stadium. I think both fan bases traveled really, really well. It was pretty loud. I think that seeing a game like that makes you wish that the Rose Bowl press box didn't have a glass partition in front of it, because then you can't soak up or feel the atmosphere as much as you can if you're at a place like an Autzen Stadium where there is no glass partition and you can really soak up every bit of that atmosphere. So that's kind of just the broad thoughts off the top for me. I haven't done one of these solo in a while, so you're going to have to forgive me as I try to knock off some rust here. I don't know if this was so much, I mean, a lot of it was just dominant Ohio State, but a lot of it was also just bad Oregon. Oregon was really struggling from the get-go in this game. If you want to start with the quarterback position, Dillon Gabriel didn't have a terrible game statistically, 29 for 41 for 299 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he was also sacked 8 times. So it was a long day at the office for Dillon Gabriel, and just didn't get very much protection from his offensive line as he got brought down 8 times. Like I mentioned, we saw a lot of Marcus Harper along the offensive line. He was in there at right guard for a decent amount of the game. Oregon's offensive line did not look like it was a Joe Moore Award finalist. It didn't look like they were one of the top 3 offensive lines in all of college football. And they went out there and got punched in the mouth. They really did. I think the game starting the way that it did, the big little slip pass to G. Scott up the sideline, and the very next play, you have Oregon with some blown coverages and missed assignments, and Jeremiah Smith scores his first touchdown of the day. He would go on to score 2 touchdowns. Just Oregon looked out of sync. But after that happened, you said, okay, you said to yourself, all right, let's see what the offense can do. Let's see if they can go out there and put some points on the board, because remember, going into this game, I think one of the big differences from the overall season for Oregon fans was probably that you were more confident in the offense, at least with how that Penn State game ended. The Ducks still won the Big Ten title, but they only won by 8 points, 45 to 37. And you left that game in Indianapolis kind of worried about where that Oregon defense was at. And what we saw against the Buckeyes showed that there was some legitimate cause for concern from that defense coming out of that game. I'll tell you guys myself, I was right. And hey, I think this is probably a one-off. I'm confident that the Oregon coaches are going to get them ready to go. I'm confident that these guys didn't forget how to play football, but they just got dominated at the line of scrimmage. So I really kind of got to that talking about Dillon Gabriel, but Dillon Gabriel was running for his life. Even though he threw for almost 300 yards, he just looked off kind of from the beginning, right? And the Ducks struggled to run the ball. Jordan James got hurt. So when Jordan James got hurt, you were already struggling to run the ball, but then you became even more one-dimensional. At this point, we can definitely admit that there's a clear drop-off between Jordan James and Noah Whittington. And Noah Whittington's a good player, but he just hasn't been able to put together those same kind of games that he did back in the 2023 season, before that season was cut short with a season-ending injury. So it was a rough day for Dillon Gabriel, but we can highlight some of the positives here. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom, right? We did see a heck of a game from Trayshawn Holden. What a way to go out if you're a senior veteran wide receiver like Trayshawn Holden. You had 7 catches for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns on a day when much of the offense was struggling, right? No Evan Stewart. That was one of the other big developments. I remember a couple drives would go in, and I'm like, why is Justice Lowe out there? Where is Evan Stewart? He's one of your starting wideouts, and he's not even on the field. Like, what's going on? Something's got to be up here. And then he just kept walking back and forth on the sideline, didn't have his helmet on. He would go into these huddles that they had during timeouts or between kickoffs and didn't have his helmet on. And then it just got to the point where it's like, okay, something's wrong. You know that he is not going to be playing in this game. And then it became out that he had tweaked something in the pregame. There were also reports that he might have hurt his lower back or hurt his back practicing for this game after the Big Ten title game. So there's a couple other things out there, but bottom line, he was hurt. So when 2 of your top players are hurt, Evan Stewart and Jordan James, it makes sense that you're going to struggle. And Dillon Gabriel having to throw it 41 times really shows you just how much the Ducks were struggling to run the ball. 28 carries, this is including sacks, but 28 carries for negative 23 rushing yards on the day. Noah Whittington scored, I believe it was a 2-yard touchdown in that game. So that was really the only bright spot in an otherwise very grim day for the Oregon ground attack. And it was just rough. It was just rough. And I think the thing that made this one so surprising to me, not just because the offensive line was struggling for Oregon, but Tez Johnson had a really good game the first time around. But when you have Tez Johnson and no Evan Stewart, you're making this offense a whole lot less dynamic. 2 guys that can really stretch you vertically, stretch the field, and present a deep threat. And now you only have one that you have to deal with. It's going to make your job easier. So that was really the story of the day for the Oregon offense. I think you had the best day, obviously, from Trayshawn Holden, and then got 5 catches from Terrence Ferguson and Tez Johnson, but they combined for like 100 yards. So it wasn't the explosive Oregon offense that we had been used to for much of the year. And it was just rough. There's really not that much more that you need to say about it. It was just a really rough day. And then for the Ohio State offense, if we're just kind of flipping this, Will Howard probably had his best game of the year, 17 for 26, 319 yards and 3 touchdowns. Buckeyes had a pretty good, I don't know if I'd say dominant, but pretty darn good day running the ball, 31 carries for 181 yards and 2 touchdowns. Travion Henderson had 9 fewer carries than Quinshon Judkins, 8 carries to Quinshon Judkins' 17, but he put up 94 yards and had 2 touchdown runs. So those guys have been complementing each other super well all year, and that was going to be a really tough assignment for the Oregon defensive front. And then the games that Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka had, they just both had great days. Jeremiah Smith, 7 catches for 187 yards and 2 touchdowns. Emeka Egbuka, 5 set receptions for 72 yards and a touchdown. And I think those performances really serve to highlight one of the areas that I think Oregon is just not where it needs to be. And that's the secondary. Oregon's defense was one of the best nationally all year, but at the end of the day, they still have some relatively small corners, relatively small safeties. And Jeremiah Smith is 6'3", 215 pounds, and Emeka Egbuka is 6'1", 205 pounds. So I think all of Oregon's starting corners, except for maybe Dante Manning, are 6 foot or shorter. And I think what's probably frustrating when you look at that as an Oregon fan is that you know that there are taller DBs, taller corners on the roster, but they're not necessarily ready yet. Kingston Lopez, almost 6'5". He might be 6'5", the coveted safety out of Northern California. You look at Jaleel Florence, who missed the whole season with injury. Dakota Fields, who missed the whole season with injury. Both 6'1" and above guys. Sione Laulea, he played this year, but not a whole lot, and he didn't really carve out a significant role. So they have those guys on the roster. That's the plan for the Dan Lanning, Tosh Lupoi defense, longer, faster corners, but those guys weren't ready yet. And as a result, Oregon got exploited down the field or even across the middle. We saw that a couple times with Jeremiah Smith. They weren't all deep shots, but that being, I think, outmatched physically at cornerback, and then what we saw from the Oregon safeties, just a lot of lapses in coverage, or sometimes there were times in this game where guys just flat out weren't ready for the upcoming plays. There were a couple of plays where you see like Jeffrey Bossa trying to get guys adjusted and make some checks. You see Kobe Savage coming down, and I just don't know. I don't know how that was something that wasn't addressed before the game. Like if that's happening multiple times and your guys just aren't ready for plays, like is your system too complicated? Is there lapses in communication? Because I think one of the things that I was talking to somebody about earlier today was like, look how Ohio State used Caleb Downs. Like they really allowed him to play as a true free safety and just roam. And that just kind of got me thinking about that age-old saying. It's not about the X's and the O's. It's about the Jimmies and the Joes. And Ohio State has an elite, deep, talented roster. Oregon has a talented roster, but it's not as deep as it needs to be. And that's, I think, what this Rose Bowl loss ultimately showed us. You have a lot of really good guys, but you need to have more overall depth. So if somebody goes down, if Jordan James gets hurt, there's got to be no drop off. If you lose one of your linemen earlier in the year, right, like you did with Matthew Bedford, how is that going to affect things? And the offensive line played a tremendous year, really, until yesterday, or not yesterday, sorry, a couple days ago in the Rose Bowl. That was the glaring weakness, the worst performance for them probably all year. So like, I don't know what the difference is, because Oregon has a tremendous offensive line coach. I'm a massive Alik Terry fan, but if Ohio State can go out there, navigate injuries, and still push Oregon around like they did, what's to stop Oregon from doing that? Is it just more about the guys that they have on that roster, or what is it? I don't know. These are all questions that we're asking ourselves. And as I'm kind of getting into this back half of the episode, And what you see on the ticker there, if you're watching this on the ScoopDuck On Three YouTube channel, where do the Ducks go from here? And maybe that's where we can go now, because I don't think there's a lot more I need to say about how good of a day Ohio State had and how bad of a day Oregon had. Because now you have fans that are kind of maybe looking at this. You finish 13-1, you win the Big Ten in your first year in the conference, but now you're leaving Pasadena. Maybe you're on your flight back to Eugene or back to Oregon or wherever you're living. And you just kind of find yourself thinking, well, what was all that for? What was going 12-0 and then 13-0 and winning the conference title? What was all that for, if not to win a national championship? Because I think Oregon was equipped to win a national championship, maybe the most equipped that they've ever been, but they ultimately came up short. And the reality of the matter is they've been in this position before. They've won conference championships. They've gone to the Rose Bowl. They've won Rose Bowls, but they still haven't done that one thing that everybody wants. Everybody in that, every coach in that building, every player in that building, every personnel person in that building wants. And what Dan Lanning wants is a national championship. They haven't been able to do that. So now we ask ourselves the question, was this season a failure? Right off the top, I say no, it's not a failure. Even if you're in that natty or bust group, right? Even if that is your thinking, unless Oregon wins a national championship this year, it's a failure. I see where you're coming from. I do. I feel like I just laid it out pretty well, to be honest. But I don't think it is, because this is the first time Dan Lanning has won a conference title at Oregon, and it was probably a lot harder than it would have been last year in the Pac-12, even though the Pac-12 had a ton of really good teams. But everybody can agree that the Big Ten is a step up from the Pac-12 in competition and the caliber of opponent that you're facing on a weekly basis. Remember that 8-game stretch that the Ducks had to face, going out to the Midwest 3 times with no bye? I think that was huge, and that's going to be a stretch that we really think about when we look at how successful Oregon's season was. And you won the conference championship as first year members in the Big Ten. That's no slouch. And sure, you lost to a conference opponent in the Rose Bowl, but you beat them to get to that conference title game and ultimately take care of Penn State. Like they did something pretty special with beating, I think, it was like beating Michigan State, Ohio State, and Penn State all in the same season. Like that hasn't been done since I don't know when. Someone can maybe comment that stat if I'm forgetting it, but that's special. And I think it just shows that Oregon is still on this upward trajectory. And I'm not trying to be a sunshine pumper or anything here and say, hey, it's all okay. You know, you went 13-0 and then you got trounced in the Rose Bowl. It's all right. Because that's not what I'm saying. But I still think there's an opportunity to look at the body of work and the direction that this program is headed and say it's overall still very positive, that Dan Lanning is the coach that I think Oregon has needed, the guy who is committed and doubling down on being the guy in Eugene, the one that's going to get the program over the hump. I think that is still very much realistic. So you won more games than you did last year, and you got out to the Rose Bowl. You made the playoff. And I think that even though the playoff was easier to make, quote unquote, this year, I think it's still admirable that you made it. So you go 12-2 in 2023 and then 13-1 in 2024. I think that this team is still trending in the right direction because they're stacking elite recruiting classes. That's one of the big things that you have to look at here, right? Oregon had a really good roster, but you still need to stack elite recruiting classes and have some continuity and consistency for guys who have been on the roster together, played in these big time games for a long time, because maybe that's a little bit of the drawback that you see with the transfer portal, right? You get a lot of these guys for just 1 year, maybe 2 years, and they just haven't been playing that much football together for as long as some of these upper echelon teams have. So I'm not saying that's the reason Oregon lost or anything like that. I just think that with all this elite talent that we see coming in, there's still other circumstances that we have to factor in here, other factors, other reasons for why we're seeing what we're seeing, why Oregon might be coming up short, here and there. So all of that said, Oregon's in a really good spot for the future, or just the 2025 college football season. Dylan Gabriel moves on. He exhausts his college eligibility, and you have a former 5-star waiting in the wings, and Dante Moore, a guy who's played a pretty good amount of football. He appeared in 9 games in his true freshman season at UCLA, started 5 of them. Sure, the results weren't always pretty, but there were plenty of bright spots there. There were plenty of reasons to say, okay, hey, I saw what he did at UCLA. I think he can do it at Oregon. Gonna have better talent at Oregon. Better receivers, better running backs, better offensive line, better defense to lean on. Whatever you want to bring up, I think the situation is clearly better for him at Oregon. So it looks like, as of right now, he's the guy for next year. That's what all the signs are pointing to, but can't discount Austin Novosad. I think he's a great quarterback, a great young quarterback who's kind of bided his time at Oregon, and he's not going to shy away from competition. So because Oregon has stacked elite recruiting classes, Dan Lanning has done a great job of hiring coaches when that's necessary, because we're in that point of the season now too, right? As we kind of get into the off season, the coaching carousel, he's done a great job hiring people, and Oregon's still a top transfer portal destination. So they have the right recipe. Dan Lanning has the right recipe. You're bringing in the top high school recruits each year, and the ranking of Oregon's classes has steadily continued to grow inside the top 5, both of these last 2 cycles, still with an opportunity to add some guys in 2025. But you're building the nucleus, you're building the foundation of this class, of this team from the high school ranks, and then you're supplementing that with great additions from the transfer portal. They have the number 4 recruiting class in the transfer portal, according to On3, with 6 verbal commitments. They're going to be hosting a top player in Mekhi Hughes, the transfer running back from Tulane, on a visit this weekend. So things are probably going to get crazy in the transfer portal, and there's going to be a lot of good players still coming to Oregon. So while I understand the frustration that a lot of Duck fans have to be feeling with another heartbreaking loss on the big stage, in the postseason, in the playoffs, you just gotta stay the course. You gotta trust that Dan Lanning's going to be able to get this team where they need to be. They're going to have the players that can get them over the hump. And that's why I enjoy what I do so much, because recruiting goes year round, and you get to see the team come together. I don't know if I'd say in real time, because it's like before, right? You see all these high school guys get kind of under this Oregon umbrella together. And then once they finish their high school careers, they all go to Oregon together. And then that's kind of how you get that next wave of talent in. And then you see these guys from the transfer portal come in, and it's a lot shorter of a window, but it's all exciting. And it's just kind of, you're watching Dan Lanning and Marshall Malco and the rest of this Oregon staff kind of put all these ingredients into a pot and hope to be able to plate an amazing dish. Is that the metaphor? Is that the best metaphor I've ever used on the podcast? I don't know. You can tell me if you've been listening for a while, but it's fun. I think that the way that rosters are built and retained in college is so much different than the NFL. And that's part of the reason that I think college football is just so much fun to cover and so much fun to watch. So we get to do it all again in 2025. And now the 2026s are going to be on the clock. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun ride. And I hope you guys will follow along as we do that. But one other note to add here, I'm going to be heading out to San Antonio, Texas on Monday to cover the Navy All-American Bowl. So there's going to be a bunch of Oregon commits there and a lot of top guys in 2026 that Oregon's going after. I haven't seen the full 2026 roster, but there's going to be some great players out there. So you're going to want to make sure you're following me on all social media platforms at Torres Sports if you aren't already. And I can't end the episode without giving a quick shout out to Ranchito Grill in Springfield. Not sure what your dinner plans are tonight, but head on over to Ranchito at 1537 Mohawk Boulevard. You got to try the homemade tortillas. They got great food, a great environment, and they will take care of you. And make sure you let them know that Max Torres sent you. So, yeah, final remarks, everyone. I mean, it was a tough day out in Pasadena. I know that a lot of people were hoping for a different result. It certainly would have been pretty fun to see Oregon come away with the win. I thought Dan Lanning handled himself very graciously in the press conference, had all these opportunities with some softball questions to criticize the playoff format or to criticize the long layoff that the Ducks had between the Big Ten championship game and the Rose Bowl. But he said, no, he didn't take any of the bait. He said that those were just excuses. So he took the blame, took accountability, which is exactly what you want to see from your head coach. And now it's back to the drawing board. So I think that this is going to be a valuable experience for Dan Lanning as a head coach, who you could say is ahead of schedule in just his third season as a head coach and his third season with the Ducks in Eugene. But even though this wasn't the result they wanted, there's still a tremendous amount of value, I think, for a head coach being in the playoff and experiencing that, going against Ohio State, knowing the type of players that Ohio State has and how his players matched up or maybe didn't match up in some other areas. That's all part of the bigger picture and what's going to make you a successful head coach. So I know you wanted a different result. I think it would have been great to see the Ducks win, obviously. I'm a little biased there because I wanted to keep covering them, see the magical season keep going, but that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. And this is going to really help Dan Lanning and the Ducks moving forward, I think. Just being there on the big stage and knowing how to navigate it better the next time around. But do me a favor, make sure you're locked in with me on social media, like I mentioned, at Torres Sports on any platform. Subscribe to the ScoopDuck on 3 YouTube channel. Really appreciate your guys' support there. Check us out at ScoopDuck.com. Subscribe. No better place to be for Oregon football and recruiting coverage. And then share the show. Share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, and with other Duck fans. But until next time, thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.